Okay, class. Today for you is Monday, September 21st. It's Friday for me. So today is a big lecture for the essay. A lot of the material that we need to cover for the essay is going to be covered today. I'm going to I'm going to say rush. I'm not going to take as much time on the end of chapter 3, just because a lot of it's straightforward, but I will certainly review it. And I have props for you today, which I did not really plan well for, but that's okay. We'll give that a shot. Remember, I believe we have the essay due Wednesday, and we're going to talk Friday, which is last Friday for you, today for me, about how our test is going to work next week. So let me just do a quick review, and we're going to share. We are going to share that map with you. This map, in one way or the other, by the way, is going to be on the test. I have different versions of the test. On every version of the test, what the colonies are known for is going to be on there. I do have one version of the test where you have to know where the colonies are. I'm going to give you a heads up. I lean away from that version because I don't want you just memorizing maps. But certainly you'd have to know what the colonies are known for at the very least and have an idea what a plantation colony is, have a few examples, what the middle colonies are, and what the New England colonies are. That's fair game, absolutely for sure. If I say North Carolina, you should know that that's a plantation colony. If I say Pennsylvania, you should know that's in the middle counties. I don't really want to go through you having to know Connecticut, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, where specifically they are. That seems like silly memorization. But some reminders of what we've already learned. We know that Georgia was that buffer area to protect the rice grown in the Carolinas, which was used as foodstuffs to feed the slaves in the West Indies who were producing the very financially important sugar. North Carolina, though, also making rice, producing rice, was more known for pirates. Our first quote-unquote successful colony, Virginia, was known for tobacco. And Maryland certainly had their tobacco as well, but was known as a haven for Catholics. Oh, no, that didn't need to move there at all. Okay. Today we're going to learn about some of these other colonies first. So I'm going to leave that up there so we just sort of have this idea. We're going to talk a little bit about New York. And New York is going to be known early on for its heavy influence by the Dutch. We last left off. The Dutch had defeated the Swiss. And so the New Netherlands had been established in basically what we think of as New York, especially Manhattan Island here, that part of New York, which is today such valuable real estate. But notice we don't call it New Netherlands today. We call it New York. And that's because the English perceive this as a really dangerous threat. The English government did, James II, I think at the time. And essentially what you have is you have English colonies all the way from Georgia all the way up through Maine. Really? Smart boy, you're not going to let me have a pen? It doesn't look like it's going to. Oh, there it is. Except for this one sort of region right through here, which was controlled by the Dutch. You can't have that sort of wedge right in the middle. It's also why the Dutch are absolutely doomed. And so James II sends, again, I think it's James II, sends his relative, the Duke of York, to go and attack essentially the New Netherlands. And as you can guess, since we call it today New York, you have an idea of who won. As a matter of fact, the Dutch didn't even fire a shot. It's probably one of the wisest decisions they ever made because they knew they would have been slaughtered. That said, now the English have control from Maine all the way through Georgia, but it doesn't mean that the Dutch don't have an influence. There were thousands of Dutch residents there, and they left behind a few things. One, they were a little bit more authoritarian, and so they kind of left that vibe there because many of the Dutch people felt that that was a normal thing. And culturally, they just left this huge imprint. These names like Harlem, Brooklyn, and Hell's Gate that are synonymous with New York, those are all Dutch names. Not to mention, you ready for this list of contributions? Easter eggs, Santa Claus, waffles, sauerkraut, bowling, sleighing, skating, and golf, which is like golf, but was more dangerous and forbidden in many areas because it was so unwholesome. Very, very interesting contributions there. So that's sort of how the English gained control of that territory and what it's known for at that moment in time. Our next territory would be Pennsylvania, or colony. So Pennsylvania is all about the Quakers. I mentioned the Quakers in another lecture about how they were dubbed Quakers because they shook with such religious fervor. Technically, their religious name is the Religious Society of Friends, and they provide a unique challenge to the authority of the English government. Quakers, then and now, there are Quakers today in the United States, take no oaths. They have deep religious convictions about nonviolence, hence they refuse military service. Some of the conscientious objectors from World War I and World War II were, of course, Quakers. And they're so serious about nonviolence that it is a well-documented fact that a devout Quaker could have someone breaking into their home, murdering their family. And even in that, where most other religions allow self-defense, they will not. They will pray for it to end, but will not take action because they believe that's in God's hands. So the British government, the English government, does not like the Quakers, and many of them are persecuted. Well, where do you go if you're English and your religion is persecuted? You go to the New World because you figure there'll be less heat on you there. Now, remember, that's why the Puritans showed up. And technically speaking, because Quakers and Puritans are both Christian but not Catholic, they're all Protestants. But the Puritans do not like this brand of Protestant faith at all. They do not like the Quakers. So William Penn, a well-known, well-established, rich Quaker in Great Britain, establishes this very well thought out, well-planned colony that gets named after him against his wishes, Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods. And it really does become a colony that it's just the best planned, has the most financial support to start off with. And its early cities, Philadelphia notably, which is very well planned out in a grid as opposed to so many other territories where it just sort of evolves and just becomes a weird mess. I mean, early New York City is a debacle, and they have to redo it in the 1800s. He purchased, William Penn even arranged to purchase lands from Native Americans. He explained to them, this is what we think of as owning land. We would like you to stay out of this territory if we give you money to do that. And agreed with what's called a walking purchase, where his emissary would walk for 3 days during daylight hours, and where he stopped, that's where they would put this marker. And the Native Americans, after financial consideration, said, okay, I don't think you can own land, but we won't go past this marker. Even 3 generations later, William Penn's grandson made another walking purchase, except he hired runners in shifts so that they could run instead of walk, and also go all night, so that they greatly expanded what would be normally considered territory you could walk through in that particular time. So you get the idea, though. William Penn is trying to do things right. His tolerance, though, and the Quaker tolerance may have, to some degree, been their undoing because they let anybody in, including people who were intolerant. So sometimes bad things would happen because they refused to kick people out that they knew were intolerant because they're so tolerant. It's a hard thing to wrap your mind around. And to show you how sort of open-minded, and for that time it would have been liberal, they only had the death penalty for 2 crimes, treason and murder. Now, in the United States today, there's only a death penalty for 2 crimes, treason and murder. At that time, when they made it only treason and murder, England had the death penalty for 200 crimes. 200 crimes. And they didn't just kill you, it was the drawing and quartering. And the Quakers, again, only had it for 2 crimes. They then briefly talk a little bit about, we don't even have them here on this map, other Quaker colonies like New Jersey and Delaware, named after Lord Delaware. And then they make fun of Delaware and say Delaware consisted only of 3 counties, 2 at high tide. That's a little Bailey joke. See, when the water level comes up, there's only 2 counties. That's kind of fun. These middle colonies that we've been discussing here, this sort of region right here, they're known for a few things: having great navigable rivers that transport their goods, having decent manufacturing, not great manufacturing, but decent manufacturing, and being bread colonies, being really productive for foodstuffs, grains in particular. So that's sort of your middle colonies. Now, your book makes the point to say the southern colonies are, the plantation colonies. New England eventually is going to have some actual industry. And the middle colonies are culturally, economically, socially, literally, physically in between, and sort of a nice transition between those two. So I believe you have every single colony what they're known for. Oh, Massachusetts, Puritans, of course. Rhode Island, outcasts. Remember, that's just where you go if you're causing trouble. And then eventually Pennsylvania serves that purpose as well. So that pretty much covers the colonies. Now let's focus on the start of the next chapter. And this is really important because we have so much of your essay information. But somebody knocked on my door, so let me pause real quick. Okay, hopefully that was a seamless transition for you. Sorry about that. Mr. Nedgedly ignored my sign. We're going to give him grief. Ignored my sign that said recording. He's jealous of me because I get to teach AP this year. We go on opposite years. And I'm a little jealous of him because he has a lot less work to do because he's not teaching AP this year. But take his class next year. It's a fantastic class. He will get you a good score. It's not as hard as AP History. Not because he's not as tough. He's as tough as he needs to be because his test is a little easier. Fantastic teacher. But don't tell him I told you so, because we wouldn't want people feeling good about their job. Okay, confident anyway. So ladies and gentlemen, let's talk about some of the stuff that's going to be on this essay. And let's just talk about the general area. So Bailey now has set up the colonies, at least most of them. And now he wants to get into some of the unique problems in the Chesapeake. Now that's that area in basically Virginia, Jamestown area, where that original colony was set up, with tobacco in particular as sort of the base of the economy. And tobacco ends up saving Jamestown and Virginia, but it has a lot of problems. Tobacco is very hard, and that's your last essay, which you crushed it on. Tobacco is a poor man's crop. It's fairly easy for the soil. So you're constantly sort of depleting the soil, and so what you have to do is move west. In the west, you're sort of brushing up against the lands of the Native Americans. And so many people see a profit in tobacco that too many people are growing tobacco, and as more and more people grow tobacco, the price of tobacco, supply and demand, goes down. There's a pretty demand for tobacco, but it does peak at a point of money is to produce even more tobacco. I'm going to talk to you and make sure you're very clear on this. I heard Mr. Nedgedly going crazy in his recording. The labor problem Bailey describes from a labor perspective only, a fiscal perspective. He doesn't get into the morals here. Trust me when I tell you Bailey understands the moral implications. It's all throughout the race. Tobacco farmers need more workers because the demand is pretty high. People can't have kids fast enough. People are having kids. There's still a high mortality rate for children. And it's very common. Back then, don't go to school, you just work on the farm. And for all the children in the family to be working, but there just aren't enough kids. People can't have kids fast enough to work enough of the fields. So they would then potentially turn that there's a moral problem with enslaving Native Americans. He brings up that from the perspective of the colonists, they die too soon, which is horrific. Then he brings up slavery. That, again, clearly there was no moral issue for them with having slaves. It's that most tobacco farmers couldn't afford slaves. Now, don't think that we're forgetting the moral implications of the idea that this is their thought process. This is insane that you go, boy, in their minds, I wish I could, but indentured servitude is a way for people to bring over workers and for workers who are desperate for a new start to get to the new world. And essentially what would happen is a contract would be signed where you would say, all right, I'm going to work for this person for, I don't know, blacksmith or something like that. You might be able to negotiate 3 or 4 years. That was not unheard of. Just the standard was 7 years. So if I said I would be Mr. Nedgedly's indentured servant for 7 years, he would pay for my passage. He would have to feed me and house me. But for 7 years, I worked for free. Now, at the end of that 7 years, I would get like a barrel of corn, so basically some food and a new set of clothes. So in a way, you are sort of a voluntary slave. Now, I don't want to use that term slave because remember the huge difference there is it is something you have chosen. And it is something that has a definitive end date. Slavery is much worse, much, much, much worse. But for that brief time period, it's sort of like that. Now, is this fair? I'll let you debate that. There's a lot of people who would argue it's fair because they have contracts. If you don't like it, don't sign the contract. There's people that would say it's unfair because these are desperate, poor people in England who feel they have no other options. Others would argue the literacy rate is not great in England. Let me rephrase. It's awful. So Is it fair? Because you probably didn't read the contract. But there are other people who say, listen, you had an idea. I'm sure you heard what was going on. Let me talk a little bit about, from the examples that I gave you, about some punishments. Now, this is the actual book that I didn't saddle you with, but this is where I got those quick samples. I whether in English, but let's go over a couple. So there's a girl named Anne, 1656. So this is number 3, a servant girl pays the wages of sin. And Anne got pregnant during her indentured servitude, so they decided they would double her indentured servitude. So we don't know how long her indentured servitude was. My guess is 7 years. She got 7 years because she got pregnant. Boy, that seems awfully harsh. But again, was that in the contract? Probably. Did she know how to read? In many ways. An unruly servant is punished. So I'm going to read through this a little bit because I think it's hard to interpret, and I want to. By the way, I'm nearsighted, meaning I see fine near. I need glasses for far, and anymore as I get older, I can't read with my glasses. It's a long story. That's why I'm taking it. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, read through this and sort of interpret some of this. So this servant comes into his female master's room, so the woman who paid for his indentured servitude, with a naked rapier. So I had told you earlier, rapier is either, there's 2 definitions. One would be like that curved knife, or a very small sword, almost more like a dagger. So he comes in, naked rapier means an unsheathed small sword or knife. And he tells her he would not kill her if she would lie with him all night and bade her to go to bed with him. Okay, so what we have here is an attempted rape. She gets away and runs in the yard, and then he catches up with her and he holds her down. He has a knife to her throat. She's holding her hands over her own throat to protect herself from getting her throat slit. And he's telling her, they're arguing. He's still trying to make this sexual assault happen. He threw her petticoats, so it'd be like the long undergarments under her dress, but basically threw those up over her head several times. And she, again, is holding her hands up to her throat, which she had 6 or 7 cuts on her hands to prove this. And it's not real clear, but she does get away. And the sexual assault does not happen. Although the assault happened, and it was very, very close and had to be incredibly traumatic. So what did he get for this? Well, he got 39 lashes on his bare back. Now, back then, that sort of thing could actually lead to your death. He had all of his hair cut off and an iron collar put on, I believe, for 1 year. Oh, it says it's up to them. And then he had 3 years added to his. This is a side note. It's really not what the essay's about. But I'm a little blown away that one girl got pregnant and she got 7 years added on. This guy threatened to murder, cut up this woman's hands, held a knife to her throat, and tried to sexually assault her, and he got 3 years. Now, he did get the physical punishments as well. But we should, wow, that was a really loud notification. Let's just turn that on to silent. So we have some examples of punishment. For your purposes, don't focus on the unfairness of sexual assault versus pregnancy. Focus on whether you think the punishments in general are fair or indentured servitude is fair. But that's the system. People grew to resent this because once you became free, now you went from being broke in England to being broke in the New World with a barrel of corn and some clothes. Are you any better off? Well, you have some options. You didn't have options in England. Every piece of land in England is taken. If you have land to pay for it, you're broke, can't do it. You in the new frontier. You move the edge of society. And on the edge of society, you can simply take the land. Who are you taking it from? You're taking it from Native Americans. And as settlements encroach further and further into Native American territory, they attack the people on the frontier. And by the way, this whole system, when you bring over an indentured servant, the government gives you 50 acres of land if you're the person who funded it, not the person who worked for 7 years. But again, people knew the system. That's going to bring us to our Hannah Benson story. So I just want to give another example. So you're living on this frontier. You're in the situation where you feel your life is in danger a lot. And you're going to be attacked by Native Americans. And let's be honest, I don't blame Native Americans for attacking. Their land's being encroached upon. Now, I'm worried that you won't understand the setup quite a bit. Sort of see the desk here. And in the Hannah Benson story, there's a fort. Well, my kid was at UConn. He gave me free stuff to give away as super prizes. So we're going to say this little camouflage thing is the fort. So there's this little frontier community. They have a fort. The Dunstan family has, oh, this camera isn't quite enough. They have this home. So the fort is here. The home is here. And then, oh, you're not going to be able to see these guys, but we'll say these are parachuting robots. This is Mr. Dunstan. And these are a bunch of his kids. And he's got a bunch, 7. These guys are the Native Americans who are attacking, okay? So really see this as well. You just use this, but you get the idea that the Native Americans are over here. Their house is here. Mr. Dunstan and his children are here. There's a fort over here. Mr. Dunstan, blue robot, looks over in this direction and sees a group of Abenaki, Native Americans who do not like, they're aligned with the French, they're Catholic, they do not like Puritans, and they do not like the English. He sees them approaching his home. And at first, he gets on his horse and he starts to head towards his home. Because at his home, he has his wife, Hannah, a midwife named Mary Neff, I think, and a newborn. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how, we're talking within a couple of days old. And at first, his instinct is, oh my gosh, I have to go to that house. And then he turns around. Historians have long debated, why did he turn around? His children are over here, okay? Native Americans attacking over here, house here. Mr. Dunstan sort of in the middle, his children here. I think, and I'm not the only one that thinks this, I think he did an emergency assessment that I do not judge him for. I think sometimes in a life or death or emergency situation, some people have the ability to just go, okay, I can't think about this emotionally, I just gotta, what can I do? He can't make it to that house in time. If he makes it to that house in time, and he did have a rifle with him, but we're talking about a rifle that takes a minute to load, so he's got one shot basically in combat. He's probably taking on, I don't know if they're even clear, but it wasn't invaders. He's not winning. He's not winning. He doesn't have enough time to get to that house. He's going to meet them at best at the same time. He has no chance to rescue his wife. All he's going to do is die with her. And if he dies with her, will the children have the sense, the youngest of which I think is 5, to get to the fort? They have the ability to get to the fort. Judging from what happens next, I would say they would not have. I think, as horrific as the decision was to make, I think he made the right choice. He turns around and decides, I'm going to help my kids get to the fort. I can't think about what's happening here. I have to think about rescuing, I think it's 7 kids. And so he runs on horseback towards them, and then he grabs up one of his kids. And for a moment, it's just going to be him and this kid, and he can't do that. Hops off the horse, and I believe the book says runs at the pace of a 5-year-old. And he's using the gun to hold them at bay. Tricky because you got one shot. So you have to make the person who's attacking you think it could be on you. And so he's trying to maneuver through this, and as he gets closer and closer to the fort, they just retreat. And he gets the kids to the fort. He saves his 7 children. But remember, and now I'm reading through this copy, this is American Voices, American Lives, and this is what story is from. Another book I saved you from, but this is an interesting story. So, technically this happens after Bacon's Rebellion that we're going to talk about, so it's not actually directly related to Bacon's Rebellion, but exemplar. It's the sort of thing that was happening all up and down the front. It's the sort of thing that when we talk about it, people were mad about. But technically speaking, this happened in 1690. There's a million other stories like it. So Mr. Dunstan gets his children. He saves them. That still leaves their midwife and the infant Martha. So the Abenaki get into the house. They rifle through to get some possessions, and they light this house on fire. I'll stop there before we even get to the worst stuff and say that imagine with a fort and a nice house that they had just rebuilt and probably thought, man, finally life is getting easier. Now, let's not sugarcoat this, though. This land they carved out, they stole from Native American tribes, and they are a threat to those tribes by their very existence. But to have your house burned down, that had to be pretty devastating. No insurance back then, but what happens next is even more devastating. So remember, Hannah had just given birth a day or two before. They take the baby out of her arms, and they swing the baby by the feet, smash its head against a tree. I would have to think that from this point on, Hannah's in shock, complete and utter disbelief. She and Mary Neff and some other people in the town, the village, homestead, whatever you want to call it, they were captured. They were taken as slaves. And they were then forced to march. Now, I'm going to remind you of a couple things. Hannah had just given birth within the last few days. If you know you've got a sister, or maybe your mother, you're old enough to remember them having a child or an aunt or whatever giving birth is a really tough, I'm told, a lot by my wife after she did, physical event. This is no easy thing. And it's not uncommon to have difficulty moving around for days and weeks, and that's why we have maternity leave, et cetera, et cetera. 2 days afterwards, and then on top of that, she's lost her child. She is on a forced march, 12 miles, which some people could not keep up with the pace, so they just killed them on the way. She kept up the pace. I'd have to think that out of it, that she was just, completely sort of checked out mentally. I don't know how else she could survive. And so they end up dividing up these captives. And Mary Neff, which is the midwife, the nurse basically that helped Hannah deliver the baby. Hannah and an English boy from some other village they had captured a long time ago. These three end up with one of the original attackers, one of the original Abenaki. And they get to a place, sort of a home base for the Abenaki. This guy tells them, hey, soon we're going to be to our main village and we're going to force you to strip down naked and run the gauntlet. If you're not familiar with what the gauntlet is, it's where you'd have 2 rows of people with various weapons. And according to him, them down naked and then force them to run through these 2 rows of people. And these people are going to take swipes at your weapons as you run by. Now, there's some debate about whether or not that was going to happen or whether or not they were going to be sold as slaves. It doesn't matter. She believed him. And I don't know if he told them this to taunt them. I don't know. But what he did was make Hannah desperate to act. Because Hannah, as a Puritan woman, I would guess, thinking about their sensibilities, would probably rather die than the thought of being forced to run naked through a gauntlet. Add to that she had just lost her baby. And I don't know that he knew her husband or other children. That night, and apparently they weren't tied up or anything like that. I imagine the Abenaki did not see them as a particular threat, that they were women and children that were completely overwhelmed and would not be a problem. The young boy and Hannah woke up in the middle of the night, got a hold of some hatchets, and started killing captors. But their captors are not all the men who invaded. It was essentially one of the invaders' families. A couple different people. Well, let's talk about who gets killed. We can kind of break this down a little bit easier. The boy from Worcester, with hatchets taken from the captors, attacked the 12 sleeping Abenaki with grim determination and deadly aim. By the time they finished, 10 of the natives lay dead on the island. Another one, sorely wounded, ran away from the wounds, and another, 12, whom Dunstan had to take back as a captive, managed to escape. Hannah scalped all 6 of the dead children. Okay. This is where it gets tricky, and this is where history gets tricky. Ladies and gentlemen, a mother who had her child snatched up out of her hand, beat to death against a tree, from killing one of the men who did that. I mean, I'm not here to make moral assessments, but I understand that. His wife, another guy who might have been one of the attackers too, his wife, their 6 children. I'm not in a position to judge, and boy, would I not ever want to be in her position. But I know this. This gives you some idea of the hatred that starts to develop along the frontier, because Native Americans hate these colonists. And from the perspective of them, stealing their land, and they could say, look what happened here. These English people killed 10 natives, including 6 children, and then scalped them. They're barbarians. The English could say, look at what the Native Americans did. They invaded this peaceful village, which, they murdered a baby, and they cut down these other people in the way. They're both doing horrible things to each other, which is why neither side is particularly interested in peace with each other, because both sides can go, oh, but they did this thing, and they're both right. History's complicated. Politics are complicated. There can be 2 truths, or you can understand the perspective of both sides. In this case, I get why Hannah did it. She becomes very famous for this, and she gets held up as sort of an exemplar of a strong Puritan woman. But I also absolutely understand why Native Americans would hate the English for not just taking the land, but for doing. So you have this tremendous tension on the frontier. That's what this story is supposed to demonstrate to you, this tremendous tension. Colonists feel they're not protected on the frontier, and they're not. Now, from the perspective of the people in the interior, the people who are the sort who are bringing over indentured servants, they're like, hey, we gave you your chance. We carved out our society. Listen, if you go to the first families at Jamestown, 85% were dying every year from starvation. So hey, I'm sure they're like, life's tough. But from the perspective of the freed indentured servants on the frontier, they're like, you could lift a finger to help us out here. And this is that frustration is what's going to lead to Bacon's rebellion. So Nathaniel Bacon is a 29-year-old planter. So in the scheme of things, financially, he's okay. He's from, I guess today, the best equivalent would be like upper middle class. And ironically, that's where so many of the rebels often come from. They're having a rebellion for maybe the lower financial classes, but they're often from middle or upper middle classes. And what he's mad about is that Native Americans are attacking on the frontier, and the governor, this guy named Berkeley, he's not doing anything about it, at least in his perspective. And it's very true that Berkeley has this very strong fur trade with Native American tribes. So he has a vested interest in sort of keeping the peace with natives, while the people on the frontier want protected. And so what Bacon does is gets together about 1,000 armed, angry people who've lived through things like the Hannah story, not the exact story, but like that, and they just start killing Native Americans. some of those Native Americans are from tribes that are friendly to the English, but they just see that this Bacon's Rebellion just sees Native Americans bad. That's what they perceive, and so they just attack. And Berkeley says, "Hey, you can't do that. Hey, well, you can't do that." And Nathaniel Bacon says, "Oh, I can't." Comes back to Jamestown and tries to kill Berkeley. Can't find Berkeley because Berkeley leaves, burns down Jamestown, burn down the Capitol. This is a huge, huge deal. And just as a history guy, you're reading this going, oh my gosh, what's going to happen next? It's so anticlimactic. Bacon dies of disease. He just dies. Back then, that's just not that uncommon for a young man to die. There's so many things that could kill you, and he dies. And the rebellion falls apart. And anybody who is identified as any sort of leadership in this gets executed by Berkeley. And the whole thing just dissipates. But it doesn't mean the angst, the anger, the resentment dissipates. And it's not just the anger and the resentment of the indentured servants who go, oh my gosh, why won't anybody protect us? That upper class that we're bringing over indentured servants, the people that benefited from the head rights, are no good. I mean, it's mostly men. I think men outnumber women like 6 to 1 or 8 to 1. And they end up just being sort of troublemakers from the perspective of the establishment. And so they look around and go, I don't know. You know, you get them for 7 years and then they just become troublemakers who look for a less troublesome workforce. And so, because apparently morals don't decisions that early colonists made, they decide to pursue another option. And even though it's financially difficult for them, they will go ahead and it's small number. It's still not something that a lot of people were doing. It's never morally right. But as far as like how common it is, it's not until after Bacon's Rebellion, because indentured servitude suddenly doesn't seem as viable of a solution. And so again, no morals being weighed into this at all. You know, oh, I know a solution for this. And that solution is going to be, unfortunately, slavery. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on that tomorrow. You really have essentially what you need to write the essay. I encourage you to read that and the Hannah Duston story again and make sure you can give your own summary. Not crazy, just it'd be a good solid paragraph. So thank you for everything you need. We will talk in our live session about our test plans and our live meets next week because they're going to be a little bit. Hope everybody has a good day after that depressing lecture, that slavery and infanticide and all kinds of other horrible things. All right, see you everybody.